So the next topic I want to talk about is George Lucas did care about the Star Wars expanded universe and was involved in the major plot points. Now I want to stipulate that at the start George never said the word canon when he was speaking in his quotes. And we all know the hierarchy of canon, so there's no real argument there because they had the hierarchy in place that George could change things if he wanted to. But there is one quote that so many people take and say that, he never cared about the expanded universe. And this is George Lucas on the EU in Starlog in 2005. I haven't read any of the novels, I don't know anything about that world. When I said other people would make their own Star Wars stories, we decided that, like Star Trek, we would have two universes, my universe and then this other one. That's George Lucas directly, people taking that a bit out of context. Because Leland Chee then followed up. As I said, he's the continuity database administrator, aka the keeper of the holocron for Lucas licensing. And he said this on sales.com in December 7th in 2005, in response to this specific Starlog magazine quote. George Lucas is certainly not bound by the EU, though he's certainly open to using things created in it, Aayla Secura and the Coruscant name, for example. On the other hand, the quote you provide makes it sound like the EU is separate from George's vision of the Star Wars universe. It is not. The EU must follow certain tenets set by George Lucas through the films and other guidelines that he provides outside of the films. So here I'm going to pop another question at you. If George Lucas didn't care about the expanded universe at all, why would he provide them other guidelines outside of the films? I'll let you just sit on that one. With the tenets set through the films and the other guidelines, that shows that George actually cared about it. And we can see this in the prequels especially, because he incorporated a lot of EU elements into the prequels. The name Coruscant was the first thing that is one of the obvious ones that I noticed, because that first appeared in the Thrawn trilogy, in Heir to the Empire to be exact, which is written and released in 1991. George took the name and kept it consistent. He kept it in continuity with the books in that respect. He's not beholden to them, but he will connect it together because he liked the name. He brought it into the prequels. Also, the double-bladed lightsaber, where we most know from Darth Maul using one in The Phantom Menace, was first invented by Exar Kun in a comic that came out before the prequels were released. Tales of the Jedi, The Sith War 3, The Trial of Ulic Qel-Droma. Quinlan Vos and Aayla Secura also made cameos in the prequels, which is really cool. And for more lightsaber origins, I have a lightsabers through the years video, either up now or coming up. It'll most likely be up by now. I'll put a link to that in the description. So, when you look at Timothy Zahn interviews back in the days, you can hear how George loved the West End Games stuff and wanted Zahn to add it into his stories, which is really cool. So George, actually in the early days at least, read a bunch of the West End Games RPG stuff and short stories. Now that's really cool. A lot of the interviews unfortunately are unavailable now because you used to be able to find them on YouTube and everything, but for some reason they've been taken down. Then we also have the future plans that George wanted to do. George wanted to create another multimedia project with 1313, the game that was pretty much finished and then cancelled and rebooted. He wanted to have books, the game, comics, toys, and even connected to the Underworld TV series that he had planned that was going to come out. And on the multimedia projects, he had a deep influence on The Force Unleashed. He went, he talked to them and everything. It's great. And also the Clone Wars multimedia project and Shadows of the Empire multimedia projects were all things that George Lucas was fairly heavily involved in, giving ideas and everything. And a great example of this sort of thing is when James Luceno was writing Darth Plagueis. Then he actually talked one-on-one with James and said that, and George Lucas was the person that says Plagueis was a mun, which is interesting, and so people did that. George Lucas also created the character of Darth Bane. He would have done the same sort of thing with Drew Karpyshyn when he wrote the Darth Bane trilogy, in that he sat down and did that. George Lucas wrote the prologue to Shatterpoint, which I don't have on hand with me at the moment, but if he didn't care about the expanding universe, why would he write a prologue in a book? George helped with Tales of the Jedi, and they actually had an idea for what their own version of the Tale of the Jedi would be. Dang it. He actually was involved in the Tales of the Jedi and gave them a history of the Sith and the Jedi that was from his mind. When they had a different idea, they said, no, it doesn't go like this. This is what my thoughts were for it. And that's what it was like. There's also this great article which I will bring up. Now, this article is a great one to read through. It's an interview with Dark Empire writer Tom Veitch. But what I really want to highlight is, first of all, how did the idea for Dark Empire come about? And Tom Veitch says, Cam Kennedy and I got the idea from sending our Marvel epic comic series The Light and Darkness War to George Lucas and proposing a new fully painted Star Wars graphic novel. George loved the idea and asked me to send him plot ideas. So there's the start point of George actually cared. George loved the idea and asked Tom to send him the plot ideas. My first idea, believe it or not, was to do a series called The Jedi Chronicles, which would delve into the history of the Jedi Knights. And George actually told him, no, don't do that. As it says here, he said he preferred that we take off from the ending of Return of the Jedi and tell the fate of Luke, Leia, Han, etc. So I put together the concepts that led to Dark Empire. Now, it should be noted that we have feedback from Mr. Lucas on the plotting for Dark Empire, and our editor, Archie Goodwin, also had a hand in the plotting. He was Mr. Star Wars to us, having written many great Star Wars comics from Marvel, as well as a newspaper Star Wars comic strip with artist Al Williamson. So this also adds to that the EU wasn't as much of a mess because they're all working together to work on the story. And then we have, how did you come up with the idea of bringing back the Emperor? And Tom says, our original proposal was to bring back Darth Vader's costume and mask with someone else inside it. We felt the Empire would want to maintain the fearsome image of Vader and wouldn't much care who was wearing the armour and breathing mask. George vetoed that idea, although it did allow us to have Vader appear in dreams and memories. He said, no, you can't bring back the Vader costume, but if you can figure out how to bring back the Emperor, that's okay. So George said directly that bringing back the Emperor was okay. The obvious way to bring back the Emperor was with cloning, which George immediately approved. There you go. George approved of the expanded universe, specifically Dark Empire and the Emperor being cloned. On to the next point. So, as shown, George did care for the expanding universe, specifically in the Dark Empire time, at least. But there was also some other books and comics that were cancelled because George didn't like the path that it was going down. So George obviously cared, and he looked over things and didn't want things to be too different from what he envisioned for Star Wars. And also, the origin of the Sith comes directly from George Lucas having a Sith species that become the name of the, I guess, sect, the big baddies. And one of the biggest things that people cry about, and it's a huge emotional thing, was the story arc in New Jedi Order. George Lucas had some pivotal times that he changed things. The authors wanted to kill Luke, but George said Han was okay, but then they didn't want to kill Han, and so they asked George if they would let him kill Chewie, and he said yes, Chewie's okay to kill. So that's, spoiler alert, why Chewbacca dies in Vector Prime. And then there's also the example of Anakin Solo, because George was thinking about the prequels at the time. He wanted them to kill off Anakin Solo instead of Jason later on in the New Jedi Order series, because he thought people would get confused between, here's two Anakins at the same time. Whether he's right or wrong, he vetoed the idea, and he actually took care enough to want to change it. Now, for some quotes. George Lucas wrote an introduction in the 1994 reprint of Splinter of the Mind's Eye. And part of it goes like this. After Star Wars was released, it became apparent that my story, however many films it took to tell, was only one of thousands that could be told about the characters who inhabit its galaxy. But these were not stories I was destined to tell. Instead, they would spring from the imagination of other writers, inspired by the glimpse of a galaxy that Star Wars provided. Today, it is an amazing, if unexpected, legacy of Star Wars that so many gifted writers are contributing new stories to the saga. So it actually really cares about it. We have a quote from John Seabrook, writer for The New Yorker, and it's an article from The New Yorker, of course. Why the Force is Still With Us in January 6th, 1997. George Lucas's day-to-day activities in the main house include the management of the Star Wars story. So right there you have management of the Star Wars story, that he actually took care enough to want to manage it. Which is probably the most carefully tended secular story on Earth. And I would agree with that, especially at this time in 1997. So interconnected and hardly any continuity errors. Unlike Star Trek, which is a series of episodes connected by no central narrative, Star Wars is a single story, a finite, expanding universe, and that's where expanded universe comes from, that idea. In the words of Tom Dupree, who edits Bantam Star Wars novels in New York, everyone in the content creating galaxy of Star Wars has a copy of the Bible, which is a burgeoning canonical document, and that's the same quote at the end as what I read earlier, but I'll finish it, that is maintained by continuity errors. It's not maintained by continuity errors, you boo. It is maintained by continuity editors. Alan Korsh and Sue Rustoni. It is a chronology of all the events that have ever occurred in the Star Wars universe, in all the films, books, CD-ROMs, Nintendo games, comic books, role-playing guides. So much role-playing stuff, RPG stuff gets connected in. And each medium is seamlessly coordinated with the others. I don't think it sounds like George doesn't care. He certainly cares enough to be involved with it, wanted to be all connected together and everything. Oh, here's another quote from Sue Rustoni. This is from June 2004 on StarWars.com. And this is in regards to George Lucas. He knows the comics very well. After the fact, he reads the comics, but obviously he doesn't have time to read the novels, all of them. George knows more about Star Wars than we do. He doesn't see the expanded universe as his Star Wars, but as ours. So there's the difference. The George Lucas viewed, he had his storyline that he told, and that's what he knows is his story. But he doesn't view it just as his story after a time, he views it as ours. Everyone can contribute to it and make great stories in it. Sue continues to say, I think this has been mentioned previously, maybe in other places, but it's not new info as far as I remember. That's the end of the quote. So, when George is saying that there's no more story for him to tell, he knows that other people have been contributing to it and that he doesn't want to actually trample on any of that too much. And I'll get to a quote relevant to that later as well. But next is Kevin J. Anderson, who's an author for the EU, in Tales of the Jedi, Fall of the Empire #1, in the letter to the editor column in June 1997. This is in a response to the criticism of the Sith and Dark Jedi in the Tales of the Jedi. This is going back to what I mentioned earlier a little bit. The background came directly to us from George Lucas. We're following his guidelines and building a story within the parameters he himself laid down. It may not match with your own ideas, but this is George's universe and he gets to establish the rules, which he did. Now, that's not in the quote, but I'm adding that in, which he did. He established the rules. Kevin continues to say, we just try to sell the best story we can within them, which, of course, you want to do. And here's an interesting quote from Timothy Zahn, who's another author from the Expanded Universe. And this is a book report interview on November in 1997. And he says, as far as I know, he, which is George Lucas, hasn't read any of my novels. From what I've heard, Lucas is a visual man. He likes the comic books for the visual aspect. Frankly, I don't think that he has time to read, so I'm not offended. Which, he wouldn't have time. He's managing other things. He's creating other movies and stuff. There's a preface in the front cover of the novel Vector Prime, which is written by R.A. Salvatore in 1999. It says, in Vector Prime, based on a storyline approved by George Lucas. New York Times best-selling author R.A. Salvatore takes the Star Wars universe to the previously unscaled heights of action and imagination, expanding the beloved story of a galaxy far, far away. Approved by George Lucas is the main part there that I want to point out. And then we have Sue Rossoni again. In StarWars.com, June 2004. In general, George doesn't see the overall story ideas or concepts. If there is a sensitive area, or if we are developing backstory of a character that he's created or mentioned in an interview, we can query him to get more information, his approval or whatever. And yes, we always query him if we're doing something drastic to a film character. I believe he does read the concepts for the games though. So, the way it was set up, George didn't need all of the details because he didn't have time to go through everything. That's what he employed people for. But he got major queries and even the major plot points that, like in New Jedi Order, and that he had say in. And here's an interesting one. The George Lucas interview with the LA Times, titled George Lucas, Star Wars Won't Go Beyond Darth Vader, on May 7th in 2008. And remember back to the quote where they were saying that George doesn't view it as his story anymore, but ours, when you're reading this one. Because George Lucas says, there isn't really any story to tell. It's been covered in the books and video games and comics books, which are things I think are incredibly creative. So he knew that he told his story that he wanted to after the prequels. And then he was letting other people write in his universe to be able to do that. So he did care about it because he said they're incredibly creative. He wouldn't say that if he didn't know. And here's a very good quote from Leland Chee. Again, interview with TheWire.com. Meet Leland Chee, the Star Wars franchise continuity cop, on August 18th, 2008. Lucas approves every important addition to the canon. He approves everything, so he cares about it. The ambitious story beats contained in the new game The Force Unleashed were permitted only after he signed off. So there's our Force Unleashed connections. And spent hours talking to the developers about the relationship between Darth Vader and the Emperor. So there you go. Why would he spend hours talking to developers of a video game if he didn't care about it? I would also add, why would he spend that much time on it if he didn't think of it as an official part of the story? If he didn't think of it as canon? So, another interesting point is in the art and making of The Force Unleashed. It says that one of the few remaining Jedi after Order 66, Master Shark T was a powerful and respected member of the Jedi Council and a perfect target for Darth Vader's secret apprentice. Those who watched the deleted scenes on the Revenge of the Sith DVD may recall a sequence in which Shark T was killed at the hands of General Grievous. She was also killed by Anakin in another cutscene. But Lucas has confirmed that, because those scenes were deleted from the final film, her death wasn't official canon. So, deleted scenes aren't canon because George Lucas said so. George put input into it. With Shark T's fate still undetermined, the Force Unleashed team decided to incorporate the character and tie up this loose end from the prequels. But how to use the iconic character became a topic of much debate. And so, they would have sorted that out. George cared enough to clarify that the deleted scenes weren't canon. George cared overall that you look at the quotes and everything. If you're looking at anything to do with the EU, George did care about it. Even if you don't think that he viewed it as canon, I mean, he didn't view it as his story anymore, he viewed it as our story, as far as Lucasfilm's whole story. So, also interesting is this interview with George Lucas. They talk a bit about The Force Awakens, but the main thing here is how he speaks about the novels and stuff. So let's just have a listen for a minute.
You know, the original saga was about the father, the children, and the grandchildren. And I mean, that's not a secret to anybody. It's even in the novels and everything. And that the children.
So that's the main point here. Let's listen to that just again for a minute.
You know, the original saga was about the father, the children, and the grandchildren. And I mean, that's not a secret to anybody. It's even in the novels and everything.
So he says it's even in the novels and everything. He doesn't say, oh, the novels aren't part of the official story, or, oh, they're not part of my story. He says, oh, that's no secret. They actually put what I was planning in my vision for Star Wars in the novels. Thank you guys so much for tuning in for this next part of my Defending the Expanded Universe series. It's been good. Pretty much, George viewed it as the official story, even if he didn't outright say it, because it went so far past just him as one person, and evolved to become the story that Lucasfilm as a whole told. But anyway, what do you think? You have a different interpretation of these. And also remember that George Lucas flip-flopped a lot with his quotes. So, yeah, thanks guys for tuning in. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.